Hello everyone, welcome to Module 5, Unit 3. This module is about advanced coding approaches. And so in some of your other modules that you may have participated in, I understand that you've learned some about qualitative data analysis, and you may have even learned, hopefully you've learned a little bit about what coding is and how you do it. And so today we're going to do a deeper dive into some approaches to coding and also talking about analytic memo writing. So our learning objectives that we hope that you will be able to achieve by the end of this module are that you'll be able to define coding and memoing, identify strategies for coding beyond indexing or simply sorting your data, but towards really generating data-driven insight. Explain appropriate use of coding strategies for qualitative data analysis, and identify prompts for writing analytic memos. You can see on your screen that we have a representation of the qualitative data analysis process. On the far left of the screen, you've got the real raw data or really particular information. And so this blue box with the word data all the way down it really represents raw data. That might be interview transcripts, that might be field notes, that might be photographs. But it's got all of that data right there. It's sort of all sitting there waiting for you to do something with it and make meaning of it. And that's where coding comes in. The coding is one of your first steps in trying to make sense of what these data say. Now, it's important to know that coding is not the only step. You can see at the far right of the screen, this is our more abstract or our more generalizable understanding of our data and what they mean, our assertions, our theories. And you can see that there are steps in between coding and in between coding to theory development. So just keep in mind that simply coding is not sufficient to complete the qualitative analytic process. We're going to quickly define coding and memoing. I believe you would have learned these definitions already, and so we're going to reiterate them for you today. Coding is the process of categorizing your data, meaning that you're really sorting your data into buckets or piles to make sense of it. And memoing is the process of recording thoughts and ideas during data collection and analysis. And the way I like to think of it is that there's two kinds of memos, although there may be many others that you would use or employ in your analytic process. But process memos are really thinking about the process of data collection and analysis. So if you're using a specific analytic approach, you might memo about how that approach is working for you, whether it's really fitting with your goals or your plans. You might reflect on data collection through memos. You know, were these the right questions to ask? Should I have paused longer while I waited for my participant to respond? Was the setting the right choice? Is the flow of the questions right? And so you can use memos or kind of, I call it like journal writing, little journal entries to reflect on the process of the analysis and also the collection of the data. And then the analytic memos, which is what we're going to talk about more today, but it's really your brief writings to yourself or little, type of journal entry. What is happening in these data and what do I see here? To the right of the screen, you see the cover of Johnny Saldaña's third edition of the Coding Manual for Qualitative Researchers. This book is fantastic. I highly recommend you get a copy. The second edition and the first edition are both very good. You do not need the third edition, although, of course, if you have access to it, it's always nice to have the updated version of a book. But if you intend to do any qualitative analysis, whether for research in a practice setting or research in a more academic setting, this book is going to be invaluable to your process. And a lot of what I'm sharing with you today is coming directly from this book or from training that I received from Johnny Saldaña himself in a couple of workshops. And so if you want to learn more, really go to this book and dig in and let it all soak in. And I think you'll be grateful. So one of the things that folks really love to ask, including myself, is, well, there's so many approaches to coding, which one am I supposed to use? And the answer, which is often unsatisfying, but the truth is it depends. But what is more satisfying, and I think what a lot of folks really enjoy about qualitative data analysis, is that you get to be creative and you get to let the data sort of lead you to where you need to go. There are two levels or cycles of coding. You've got your first cycle coding and you've got your second cycle coding. For a lot of folks out there, this is going to be your first time conducting qualitative data analysis whenever that happens, whether you're doing it under a mentor or you're doing it on your own. You're probably going to be using first cycle coding and not going much further than that. And in my opinion, that is perfectly okay. First cycle coding really helps you sift and sort your data, make sense of what you have, and start to think analytically about what these data mean. Whereas your second cycle coding is really a deeper dive. You're making meaning of that data. You're going back in, you've already coded, and now you're going back into your data and you're adding additional codes. Maybe you've got one big bucket of everything about leaving a job, and you want to say, well, what are the reasons people left this job? I've got all these excerpts coded for when someone talks about leaving their job, but now I want to go in and I want to code, or they left because they wanted to start a family. They left because they were fired. They left because they got an offer at another company. And so all of these kind of sub-themes or sub-ideas underneath leaving a job might make you take that leaving a job code and then go really even deeper into it and create additional codes. We're not going to talk more about second cycle coding than that, but just know that that is something that is available to you. So today we're really going to focus more on this, quote, first pass, sifting and sorting your data towards the idea that you will eventually be diving deeper and making meaning of what it is you have. So you can see I've got a couple of bullet points of different kinds of first cycle coding. These are just words that describe the type of coding approaches that you might use. And the beauty is that you can mix and match all of these approaches. And there's a lot more in Saldaña's book, so go there to learn more. I've selected a few that I find particularly useful, especially for new qualitative data analysts, and we're going to go deeper into each of those now. So the first one I want to talk to you about is called in vivo coding. And in vivo coding, you use words or short phrases from the participant's own language. And this is especially nice when there's something that maybe the participant really, and a lot of times this is true, can say it better than any way you would have ever come up with, especially if you have multiple participants all talking about a similar phenomenon, and if they're using the same language, meaning the same phrases, or if they're talking about the same thing, but one person names it in a way that really represents it for the rest of the data. In vivo coding can also be used for indigenous terms or terms that are really specific to a culture, a subculture, a microculture, a group. This, again, good for beginning qual researchers because you don't have to think too hard. It's just, am I hearing something in these data that really makes sense and that I want to use to sift and sort my data? And it honors the participant's voice. So, for example, you've got 3 codes here and then a fourth. 3 come from Saldaña, who has done a lot of research with young folks and young folks in school. And so these are some codes from young people's language themselves in his data when someone said they hated school, using that and applying that. Every time someone talks about a dislike of school or something they didn't like about school, might use that phrase, hated school, or stopped caring, or I don't know. And then the Bermuda Triangle is an example from my own research that's emerged in research with young folks in Chicago talking about sort of reliance on these 3 social services in a particular neighborhood. And they really, the way they talked about it is that people get, quote, stuck using these resources and can't really break out of the dependence that they have on them. And so they started calling these resources the Bermuda Triangle. And so that every time someone would talk about these 3 resources and getting stuck in them, for lack of a better word, I started calling that in their own language the Bermuda Triangle as I was coding my data. And so something to think about with coding, just to reiterate what you've likely already heard in some of the previous modules, is that coding is just a way to organize what you have in front of you. And so you can imagine that you have this messy room and you've got things strewn all over the place, and you want to clean up the room, and you have a lot of stuff in the room that you want to either get rid of, or you want to donate, or you want to fix up, but there's just too much and it's a bit overwhelming. Well, the first thing you might start by doing is finding all of the like things or like items and putting them together just to take an inventory of what you have. And so you gather up all the pairs of shoes and you put them in one pile. You gather up all the empty cups that you left on your dresser and you put those together. You've got your towels, you might go put those in another pile. And then you can kind of step back and say, oh, okay, yes, this room is messy, but at least now I've got my pile so I can see what I have. And that's what coding really allows you to do. It allows you to say, I have this much in this category, I have this much in this category. Let me see how those categories relate to one another or how these things come together to make sense. Next type of coding that I'd like to talk to you about is called process coding. It's also called gerund coding. And this is really popular in grounded theory approaches to analysis, which you've heard about in previous modules. And gerunds, as you might remember from your elementary or high school days, is really an ing word. And it's something that helps to connote observable and conceptual action or movement in your data. And so, as some like to say, if it moves, code it. And so really this is nice when you're trying to analyze or examine a particular process. For example, Kathy Charmaz, who has written a book about constructivist grounded theory, and you may have learned about her already as well, does a lot of research on the experience of the process of illness and of dealing with illness. And so she uses gerund and process coding for when people talk about what it's like to experience illness, to deal with illness, to go to the doctor's office, to get your medication. All of those things are a process. And so you've got some examples here at the bottom of the screen. So telling others, that process of telling others about whatever the phenomenon of interest is. Sticking by friends, that's talking about relationships. And so process coding and Vivo coding, these are two codes that you can mix and match. You can use them both in your data depending on your needs. Another coding approach that is a bit more complex than the first two we just talked about is called values coding. And Saldaña does a really nice job of talking in much more detail about this in his book. But values coding is really consisting of three sort of categories of codes, if you will: values, attitudes, and beliefs. And so values is the importance we attribute to oneself, another person, a thing, or an idea. So for example, a code representing values might be respect. Attitudes are the way we think and feel about ourselves, about someone else, about things or ideas. And so a sample attitudes code might be dislikes lame excuses. So every time somebody or in the data there's a representation of the sort of dislike of lame excuses or dislike of something in particular, you might use that code. And then beliefs. So again, these are sort of types of codes. The value itself isn't the code, but value is the code family, if you will. And then beliefs, a system that includes values, attitudes, personal knowledge, experiences, prejudice, morals, and other interpretive perceptions of the social world. And so an example code here from Saldaña's own data is the ideal is possible. And so what he really suggests is in order to identify the full value system in your data, and this might work well if it's a case study of one individual or one group of people, but it could work for a much larger study as well, is what happens at the intersection of values, attitudes, and beliefs. And so by coding in these three families, you can sort of see how they interrelate and interact to figure out what your larger value system is in that data. And then one more coding approach I want to talk to you about is emotion coding, and this is really nice for research on intrapersonal or interpersonal experiences between people, between groups, and it labels emotions recalled and or experienced by the participants or inferred by the researcher. And some examples you can see at the bottom of the screen are when someone's talking about a specific issue tearing me apart, and that might also be an in vivo code. So you might have a code that comes directly from a participant's language or their words, but it also might be a certain type of value or a certain type of emotion or a process. You can see here, tearing me apart is an emotion code. It's also likely a gerund/process code, and it's also probably an in vivo code. And so that's okay. That shows you how a lot of these codes sort of overlap. Mild surprise, relief. So these are all types of emotions that, depending on your constructs of interest or your research questions, you might code for in your data. So the ways that you develop a code list are you might look to a conceptual model that you developed when you were preparing to conduct the study. You might look to established theoretical models or frameworks. There's a lot in public health that are really instructive. You will look to your research questions. What is it? Why did I do this study in the first place, and what is it that I'm trying to understand? You might look, this is a really good one, look back at your data collection guide or your tools. So for example, if you conducted interviews, what were the questions on your interview guide? And those might tell you right then, these are the 15 codes based on these 12 questions that I really want to figure out what they are. What I like about these sort of, quote, advanced coding approaches that I just went over a few of them with you is they give you ideas for how to create those codes and what those codes might be getting at. You can also develop your coding list based on your emerging concepts, really popular in grounded theory. So you start looking over your data and reading it, and I encourage you to read it and reread it and then read it and then reread it again, or look at it if it's photographs, or listen to it if it's something like an audio file, and then allow the code to sort of jump out at you. What are the categories I see here to make sense of my messy room or to make sense of my data? And then in vivo codes are always a really nice way to begin by developing a code list. Another way to think about your codes and through your analytic process is thinking about your study's Trinity. What are the three major codes, categories, themes, or concepts? And this might happen later after you've coded everything. What are the three things that are jumping out at you? If there are three things, which of the three is the most important, and how do the other two relate to that? And how does that most important thing, or that most important code, influence the others? And are there other trinities in your data? So you've got these three that cluster together that are really salient and important, but are there other trinities that you see? And these are just ways to help you think about, okay, I've got these data, I started to code them, now what do I do with them? And when you get to that point, I encourage you to read more, write more, and talk more with people who have experience with this, because it's not easy to go from coding to the next step of sort of making meaning of your data. Now, I want to finish up by talking to you about analytic memos. I mentioned them at the beginning, but here are some of Saldaña's recommendations for how to focus your analytic memos. So you might write about any of the things you see here on your screen. How do you personally relate to the participants or the phenomenon that you see in your data? What are participants' routines, rituals, rules, roles, relationships? That question is especially important in ethnography when you're really trying to understand a specific culture or a specific group. What are the emergent patterns, categories, themes, and concepts? What are the possible networks and links between my data or between my codes? What's emerging as something new, and what is emerging that relates to theory that already is out there? How can I frame my data based on theories that others have already discovered? Are there any problems with my data? And this is that process memo that I was talking to. Is there something that every time a participant starts to talk about X, I want to know what they're going to say about Y, and we never get there? Is that because we didn't ask the question properly? Is it because we ran out of time? You know, if there's information missing or insufficient, this is an opportunity for you to memo or journal about what you think maybe went wrong or what went really right. This data is so rich and interesting, you might journal about how you think you got that high quality data. And then you've got a couple more here, any personal or ethical dilemmas with your data. You can write meta memos. So once you've written a good number of memos, that could be 5 memos, that could be 30. You know, what are your takeaways from all those memos? And then tentative answers to your research questions. That might really come later in your study. And you've heard a lot about promoting health equity throughout these different qualitative approaches and processes, and I'm going to talk about it here as well today. By this point, you're well aware what health equity is, but it's health based in social justice, based in fairness, and really, you know, overcoming oppression and marginalization so that people can achieve the health that they have a right to have. And so one of the ways that you can promote health equity through these advanced coding approaches is really highlighting and valuing participants' voices and their values. And so that might happen through in vivo coding, where you're actually using their words. It might happen through values coding, where you're really zeroing in on what matters to them. drawing attention to community or participant identified issues or concerns or assets. So maybe you went into the study interested in a specific topic, but what keeps emerging is a different topic. You can really respect your participants' needs, wishes, and move towards health equity promotion by paying attention to what they say matters and what they want to talk about. Identifying structural inequity and oppression within your data so that you can figure out how power and privilege shapes what it is you're seeing. And based on that, identifying solutions and recommendations that might help to overcome these structural inequities and fight back against oppression. I'd like to ask you to go ahead and move on to quiz in 5 through 3. I really hope you've enjoyed the presentation today, and good luck with your coding.